It's the last day of the year 2021. I'm Smitha Nair. This is your weekly fix. This year, India ranked 142 out of 180 countries in the World Press Freedom Index. And nowhere is being a journalist tougher than in Kashmir. Sure, the complete communications blackout, the longest ever in any democracy following the stripping of Jammu and Kashmir's special status on the 5th of August 2019, made reporting nearly impossible. But even routinely, Kashmiri journalists face a violation of their rights, the threat of being detained, interrogated without apparent cause, of being charged under the anti-terror law UAPA, of their homes being raided, of being stripped of their dignity. Anuradha Bhasin, editor of the Kashmir Times, one of the oldest English dailies in Jammu and Kashmir, has been one of the loudest and most prominent voices advocating for press freedom. It was Bhasin who moved the Supreme Court against the Modi government's unprecedented and total communications blackout. Her petition was instrumental in getting the Supreme Court to push the government to relax curbs on communication and be transparent about its restriction orders. Kashmir Times was founded by her father Ved Bhasin in 1955. Anuradha started as a trainee in the early 90s, a time of terrible violence in the valley. Anuradha has experienced firsthand the threats and intimidation by both militants and the state. To keep a daily running, while sidestepping the pressures to toe the line, and despite the squeezing of finances by withdrawal of government advertising and the threat of tax raids, is no stroll around the Dal Lake. So, what is it like being a journalist in Kashmir in 2021? Let's ask Anuradha Bhasin. Anuradha, thanks so much for making the time.
Thank you for having me here.
What is the biggest lie the government has said of the situation in Jammu and Kashmir post August 5th, 2019? A lie that local news persons couldn't perhaps at the time fact check and subsequently communicate to their readers or indeed those living outside of the state. But you now know to be a lie.
It's very difficult to answer any one particular lie. It's been a lie throughout, right from the very beginning. That things are normal, things are under control, there is no human rights are violated, no civil liberties are curtailed, people are going about their normal lives, right from the very first day that we heard, or the kind of justifications that were propped up while abrogating Article 370. For any thinking person, the questions were, if it was so good, why is it that so many restrictions had been imposed? There's been complete denial ever since. And the officials became more and more inaccessible as time went by. I mean, initially there were restrictions. In some areas there were more, in some areas there were less. There was the internet ban in Kashmir Valley, in Muslim majority areas of Jammu region. There was a partial internet ban throughout the state. So it made the access to several officers very difficult. Other than that, there was an overwhelming climate of fear. So even stories that had to be done regarding health, regarding education, it was just so difficult to get an official version from anybody. The doctors were unwilling to speak. The officers were unwilling to speak or were inaccessible. And that, I think, even after the internet ban was not there and the restrictions had eased, the inaccessibility of officials remains an issue. If you reporters, if they ask the officers for a version of the story, and particularly with related to you know militancy related stories where the actions of the security forces are under question for violating standard operating procedures, or there are allegations of human rights violations or of staged encounters.
Hmm.
The questions are either not taken, not entertained. The officers don't pick up the phone, or they keep parrying your questions, or they now it's so brazen that they just tell the reporters, okay, don't do this story, there would be consequences.
Right. Could you take us through the days and weeks following that unprecedented communications blackout? Specifically, as an editor, could you at all reach any of your reporters or staff? What were you able to publish then? Surely, as a journalist working in Kashmir for decades, it wasn't the first time you were facing the challenge of how to communicate, but how was this different?
Within the state, except in Jammu, the Hindu majority areas of Jammu region, where we were in touch with our staffers, though it was difficult for some of them to reach office, or they were relying on mobile internet, which was not available, so they had to travel a bit of distance and try to get connectivity from other places. But these were the areas where there were lesser stories. The more stories were in the areas that were more militarized, and there was no connectivity at all.
Okay.
I think for weeks together, we had no connectivity, or even more than months, in Rajouri, Punch, in the Chenab Valley, where there was a complete silence. In Kashmir, again, the similar problem existed till 16th of August, where 17th of August, rather, I got the first call from my bureau chief from that kiosk that had been set up, which was called the Media Facilitation Center, which the government had set up to facilitate media persons to be work from that area. Now, over 200 people working out of a space where three computers had been put up under complete surveillance. So it was impossible to actually work. You had to jostle for space. You could hardly get 5 minutes. There was one mobile phone where all phone numbers were being noted of the person calling and the person who had been called.
Hmm.
And this was the situation. So the first 1 week, we really had nothing. We had no idea of whether our staffers were safe or not, because Kashmir has had a history
Hmm.
which is not very pleasing, where journalists, among many others, have been the target of the militants, of the Indian administration, of the security forces, and which is so easy to do in a militarized area.
Right.
What we were actually doing was relying on official handouts. We were relying on reports from Delhi and using them as sources. The only other thing we could do was, try and reach out. Where were the people's voices? These were completely missing. If there was something appearing in the national or the foreign media, we tried to pick it up, tried to verify as much as we could, and use these as sources. We scanned the social media and tried to look at voices where there were some people who had traveled out of Srinagar, so trying to reach out to them and get a sense of what was happening. But there wasn't much that we could get, because most people who were coming out, interestingly, had knew only what was happening in their own homes,
Hmm.
or maybe what was happening next door, or what was happening on the in the through the distance between their homes and the airport. So these were very, very sketchy stories, very insignificant stories, but this is the best that we could do. And it's only gradually that the other stories came. But by then, there was also an overwhelming climate of fear. Many of the journalists had kind of self censored themselves in that climate of fear and were unwilling to speak. The fear was genuine.
Okay. Ms. Basin, I want to ask you, at the time, how much of this so called normalcy in Kashmir narrative being put forth by much of the Delhi based mainstream media, particularly television news, were you aware of? And how did that make you and other journalists who risk far more than any of us do feel?
The whole national media narrative was just so unnatural.
Okay.
It was in contradiction with the history of Kashmir, with the landscape of Kashmir, the political landscape of Kashmir that we have been accustomed to in the last, particularly in the last 30 years. And anybody who's familiar with Kashmir would know that something drastically wrong is happening within.
Hmm.
There are voices that are unheard. The immediate thing was, in the days before the abrogation of Article 370, it had become clear that something is happening. Nobody knew exactly what. And so there were rumors, there were guesses, there were a lot of these helicopter sorties that had been going on throughout the previous nights, and there was fear and panic that there would be massive airstrikes. And those were the first 1 or 2 days that we could not hear any voices. Those were the fears that there have been massive, maybe killings, bloodshed. Well, thankfully that did not happen. But what was missing in those stories were also the huge number of people arrested, and the within a day that we got to know that the entire political brass had been arrested. So it was common sense that anybody who was somebody, and even commoners, they won't have been spared. If three former chief ministers could be incarcerated
Hmm.
without any substantial reason, what was the safety of the commoners?
Right.
And as a journalist, also, I mean, these were questions before us. I mean, this was a major story, and we were just unable to tell.
Which is when you decided to move Supreme Court.
Journalism has always been a razor's edge walk, in Jammu and Kashmir, always.
Hmm.
And we faced many challenges. In Earlier also, I mean, in situations of curfew, in situations of restrictions, reporting and publishing has been challenged, severely challenged. In 2010, in 2013, newspapers could not be published for several days. In 2016, newspaper offices were raided and newspapers were seized and were not allowed to be circulated. Even before that, in the 90s, I remember when I was a young reporter, the the transmission tower somewhere in Banihal, between Jammu and Srinagar, had been blown off, and the STD calls were not feasible. And everything else connected with that, those new technologies, the teleprinters, the telex machines and fax machines were not working. So we went back to the old system of the trunk call dialing,
Oh,
and we used to have back to back lightning trunk call booked, so that the bureau from Srinagar could virtually dictate stories on phone, and we would take notes and type it out in Jammu office, and that's how we operated. But it was never an absolute freeze.
hmm.
So this situation was unprecedented. There was a complete freeze. There was absolute silence. An entire population pushed behind an iron wall. You can't hear those voices. You can't reach out to them. And these are areas that have a history of violations, of massive violations. So it was just so drastic, and it required drastic actions, and that was the only option I had.
What about routinely? Is the detention, even the arrest of journalists, more common in Kashmir than anywhere else in the country? How easy is it for a journalist to be picked up or detained with no apparent justifiable cause? By easy, I also mean, does it pretty much go unchallenged?
To be fair, this has been happening even before 2019. It's been happening forever. In the 90s, of course, it was a different situation when journalists were caught between the two guns of the militants and the security forces, and an oppressive atmosphere where there was physical threat to life. Journalists would be picked up, they would be beaten up, and by both sides.
Hmm.
And in post 2010, we saw more of this method of squeezing publications, arm twisting them into towing their line by stopping their advertisement flow. And the entire reliance of the regional newspapers in Jammu and Kashmir has been the government ads.
Right.
So that had been going on for quite some time, but it was much more subtle. Now it became more and more brazen.
Hmm.
That you could earlier, the criticism, the government expected that the criticism would be mild. Now there was complete intolerance to criticism, and that keeps increasing. And the more you toe their line, the more they want you to just become amplifiers of the government narrative.
Hmm.
And even those publications that have been towing the line of the government in hoping that their advertisements will not be stopped and they will be able to publish, or that cases will not be lodged against them, or raids will not happen, which is happening. But even for minutest of criticism, these punitive actions are being taken against them. And this is not just happening with editors, it's also happening with reporters who are working for these newspapers. It's happening with reporters who are working for the national press, reporters who are working for foreign press, or the freelancers. And the freelancers, in fact, much more now. The reporters are called to and summoned to police stations. These are verbal summons. They're not even legal summons. But you're expected to go. If you don't go, there would be consequences.
Okay.
They could land up at your home. They could harass your family. They could raid your houses, take away your electronics. And if the journalists take the summons seriously, visit the police stations, they have been harassed, they have been subjected to grueling interrogation for hours, they have been abused and even slapped.
Hmm.
Cases have been filed against them. And now journalists are supposed to file some verification forms, which also require parting with personal information of themselves, of their family members, to so that the government can acknowledge them as bona fide journalists.
Oh, what about threats from militants?
I haven't seen of examples in this new wave of militancy in the last 10 years. If they pose to any threat to media, there may be a few aberrations, but and that's primarily because the new breed of militants, they are relying more on the, so they initially they were relying on the social media.
Right.
They seem to have their own network that they are operating out of. They're not relying on the media anymore.
Hmm.
So those threats on the media are not there.
Okay. Uh, could you talk to us about journalists of national dailies and TV channels posted in Kashmir? Over the decades, what has been your understanding of whether or not they are able to accurately convey what's happening in the state, and how much of that is censored by the editors in Delhi? And have you seen a visible change in national media coverage of Kashmir?
Much of it has always been censored by editors in Delhi. Even when there were no television channels, the good old times, it wasn't just newspapers. Journalists in Delhi have often viewed Kashmir from a very ultra nationalist perspective. And so most of their staffers posted in Kashmir are Kashmiris.
Hmm.
And often they do not trust even those reporters because of their maybe ethnic or religious affiliations, or because they feel that they would be more hamstrung with the local issues. So they've been flowing in teams from or reporters from Delhi to Kashmir Valley, whenever something big happened, despite the fact that the bureau or the staffer is existing there. And there were occasions I heard of at least, some reporters who conveyed to me who had been visiting from Delhi and who had filed their reports, and their reports were killed. They were not carried, and instead, news agency, PTI, UNI news bulletins were preferred over their own exclusive reports. So there was always a lot of censorship, but some amount there was a lot of dwarfing of what was certain news that would be critical of the government, of the military,
Hmm.
and or complete blanking out of that. But some bit of reportage would still be there, which would effectively bring out the larger picture of Kashmir. And I think that space is shrinking even more now.
Hmm.
It doesn't exist at all, at least in the print media. In television channels, I mean, you see a completely different thing. I mean, television news. There's hardly, I think, the local reporter would get a minute or so to say, and has already been trained how to say it and what to say, and what limited to say. And the rest of the news has been converted into these opinionated panel discussions, which are so one-sided, where the panelists are not even allowed to speak in the name of debate. And you just see that space within the Indian media shrinking for with regard to speaking the truth about Kashmir, with regard to informing the nation about Kashmir. And the only silver lining is the digital media platforms, some of which are doing a great job.
What about, do you see the rest of India as being suspicious of and largely antagonistic in how they view Kashmiris? And how about vice versa? And would you say that a large part of the blame lies on the doorstep of the press?
Of course, the media has shaped that narrative. The media has shaped that kind of a notion about a Kashmiri, where a Kashmiri exists only as a terrorist. At best, the better image of the Kashmiri in the media is, somebody who's hospitable, who's connected with the tourism industry, but seen essentially as a bot trapped between in a territory where a Kashmiri has no agency, no aspiration, no emotion.
Okay.
So that kind of picture is something that we owe to the media, which consistently built up over the years, and vice versa. Yes, definitely, because when this image of a Kashmiri that captures the mind of the nation's mind, they tend to celebrate the misery of the Kashmiris, thinking that this is the best thing that could happen to the nation. This is the best thing that could happen to Kashmir.
Hmm.
Speaking from a very patronizing position, or even a sadistic position, that creates a certain mindset about Indians in the minds of Kashmiris. That's how they see India, and that's how they see in Indians. Earlier Kashmiris would be critical of the Indian state. There was anger against the Indian state for what it was doing. There was anger against the Indian state's agencies for what they were doing. Right from manipulation of politics to militarization to tyranny to human rights violations and other things.
Hmm.
But now they see also, there's also anger against the Indian citizens, the normal Indians, for what they for how they have celebrated their misery. If you saw the comments, post 2019, how people regaled and rejoiced, we will go and marry gori gori ladkiyan, or we'll buy nice land somewhere near the Dal Lake. And that kind of a narrative, I don't think it just widens the gulf between the two.
Okay. And all this, what kind of a toll does all this take on the mental health of the Kashmiri journalist?
Immense, immense, psychological pressure all the time. And particularly now, it's just very, very tiring. And when there's fear all the time, initially, earlier there was, as I said, physical threat from both sides.
Hmm.
Today it's not just physical threat. The threat exists in different forms. Tyranny exists in much more subtle forms, in more invisible forms. There could be cases slapped against you, there could be raids against you. You could just be and I spoke to journalists, and then they spoke also of constant fear of somebody just hitting their car while they're going back home. And these are very genuine fears that come up. And there are fears that your family members would be targeted, because that is happening. And that is something very difficult to live with.
Hmm.
I think, like the larger population, I think journalists today, how it's difficult for them to bring out a story of others, because half the time they're grappling with their own depressions, their own the mental trauma that they are dealing with constantly. And every other story that they do, that also adds to their mental trauma, because when you report another person's story, and you're reporting another person's misery, and you're reporting something that is even new policies that would have larger repercussions, and when you start working on that, even that weighs so heavily on your mind.
Well, despite the many challenges you have faced, Anuradha Bhasin, you continue to be a prominent voice on the subject of free speech. I want to close by asking you about the fact that you and Patricia Mukim, editor of the Shillong Times, have now moved to Supreme Court challenging the constitutional validity of 124A, India's much abused sedition law. Talk to us about how you and Patricia got together and your hopes from the Supreme Court.
How we see it is, sedition has not been used against any journalist or media person in Jammu and Kashmir so far. But when you see the numbers rising across India, and in the way that it is being used against, apart from other laws, against media persons, it's much more frightening for journalists living in the peripheries.
Hmm.
What Patricia Mukim, I mean, Northeast situation and Kashmir has been very, very similar. And though in North Kashmir there were one or two odd cases where sedition had been slapped against journalists, and which is why I think it all started with Patricia, because Patricia was worried about it, and we were having this conversation, and we were aware of how particularly differently it could be used in these peripheral areas, where journalists or even other activists could be targeted, and it would be in the national imagination, it would be still legitimized because of the ethnic or religious identities of the people who are the target of that law.
Hmm.
For instance, if somebody from Nagaland or Manipur or a Kashmiri Muslim is to be slapped with a sedition charge, can actually visualize how the television channel, anchors would just go ballistic over, uh, demonizing that person, and would do it with so much legitimacy, and the nation would believe it. So we thought it was important too. I think it was more Patricia's initiative, and but I agreed with her, so I joined.
Well, more power to you. Thank you, Anuradha Bhasin, for joining us on this podcast, and thank you for what you do.
Thank you.
Thanks also to our listeners for having stayed with us through this conversation. That's it on the final episode of the year 2021. I'm going to be back next year. Thank you.